Reactive Training Systems.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the RTS podcast. I have a bit of a different style episode for you today. Today, I'm being interviewed by RTS coach Gaby Muller. So Gaby's one of our newer RTS coaches, and she's also still pursuing a degree. And as part of her assignment, she needed to complete an interview. So we kind of scheduled this time this morning to do this interview, but unsurprisingly, Gaby asked some really tremendous and insightful questions. And kind of toward the end, we realized I think what we have here might be interesting for our podcast listeners. So I don't think there needs to be a lot of preamble or introduction here. Mostly what you'll hear is me monologuing on and on about different ways of planning and constructing training. But I do think Gaby asks questions that bring out some different types of emphasis or different answers than what you might have heard prior to this. So the attentive listener will notice the skillful question asking that Gaby does here. That can only really be done because she has so much knowledge that she's bringing to the table to begin with. So I would like to kind of repeat the process a bit and get a lot of her insights on some of these very same questions. So if you listen to this, you enjoy it, let us know. If you want to hear more podcasts and things like that are kind of conducted in this vein, let us know that and we'll see if we can do more of it. So without any further delay, I'll set up this interview and I hope you enjoy.
I recently listened to the podcast where you had you were more kind of the moderator of a debate between John Kaidy and Mike Israetel. So I would really like to hear your input further on periodization models and where emerging strategies come into play. And I know that you've been coaching for many, many years. And also you've trained yourself for many years before that. So I was wondering if you ever followed the traditional periodization model methods before you came up with the idea of founding reactive training systems and the whole strategies of emerging strategies.
Yeah, definitely. Let's see. So if I started coaching in, say, 2004, emerging strategies didn't come on the scene until 2015, 2016. So most of that time, all that time was spent using more traditional planning models. And we even taught courses on traditional planning models and things like that. But then it was around 2015 that kind of had my paradigm shift. What I had noticed issues over the years, things that didn't quite work with traditional planning models, things that were frustrating, just things that didn't quite add up, didn't quite make sense. And I knew that they were planning model problems. I knew that they were top-down planning model problems, but I didn't know what a bottom-up strategy would be that was sensible. You say, okay, well, if this is a top-down planning model issue and a bottom-up model should theoretically fix it, what does a bottom-up model look like? And I got as far as Bulgarian style daily 1RM training. Well, I'm not doing that. That comes with so many other problems that it's just not practical. So I kind of got stuck at that level for quite a few years, 5 years or so. And then it was around 2015 that I came across some work from Derek Evely, who was a coach who worked for Dr. Anatoly Bondarchuk. And when Dr. Bondarchuk moved to Canada and was coaching Canadian throwers, and I was listening to him on a podcast, and I'm thinking what he's describing is a bottom-up planning approach, but it's a sensible one, So I got really excited about that and started the process of converting what he was talking about for throwers, like take that and convert it into powerlifting. And that's more or less where the bones of emerging strategies came from.
That's pretty cool. So I'm just going to talk about like the limitations, because every model, I guess, has limitations. And I know that emerging strategies, like
Totally.
the core principles are you just follow the trail of athlete response. So you don't have a fixed model. Whereas like with traditional models, for example, you have different periodization models where you work on specific qualities, let's say like each block. And the closer we approach competition, the more we tend to shift the focus on strength. So the idea behind that is that we experience positive effects because we're highly sensitized to that new training stimulus. But at the same time, we also know that late rate of force development is a skill that some athletes need regular practice in. So with emerging strategies, is there a different way that you resensitize your athletes to training stimulus without neglecting the strength components during the blocks?
Yeah. I think all of these issues like still apply, right? That the human body doesn't really change because of the planning model that we're using. So we still have to be attentive to those things. And over the years, like I've grown in my appreciation for what a top-down model gives you. You know, it lets you kind of skip the line on some of this stuff. You don't have to think about so much sensitivity to certain stimuli, or you can take for granted the sequence of things because it's all built into the model. And when you move away from that, when you implement a system that's not constrained in those ways, it's up to you to stabilize it, right? It's like if you were only doing Smith machine squats, and you got really good at Smith machine squats. Then all of a sudden you did a free weight barbell squat. You would have to stabilize in all these different planes of movement and it would take a lot of conscious effort in the beginning because before the machine was stabilizing you, and now you have to stabilize yourself. And I think it's similar with a top-down approach. A lot of this stuff kind of gets baked in and you don't have to think about it very much. But then when you start a bottom-up approach, an emerging strategies approach, it's no longer taken for granted and you have to control that aspect of things. That was something that I did not appreciate enough in the early years of teaching emerging strategies. Really, when you boil it down, emerging strategies is an information processing system. It helps you identify, like you said, the trail of athlete response and helps you follow that. And in the early years, I was thinking that should be enough. If you're collecting the data, you're observing the trends, and you're following those trends effectively, then that should take you where you want to go. And you probably don't need a whole lot of like prior knowledge on top-down approaches and things like that. And that was incorrect. I did not appreciate fully just the vast array of possible training interventions and how many of them are probably not good ideas. How many sequences you could make that are not good ideas. Basically, how many wrong answers exist. And once I appreciated that, I thought, one of the things that helps me implement the system effectively is a lot of prior knowledge on top-down approaches, physiological responses to training and things like that. Like I brought a lot of that with me and it helped me to stabilize those degrees of freedom more effectively when I moved to the bottom-up approach. And so more recently, I still prefer the bottom-up approach. And if I'm teaching a new coach, then I want them to learn that, but they also need to learn the top-down approaches, at least to an extent. They don't have to use that necessarily, but just to have the background knowledge to fill in information gaps. We could go further on that if you like, but
Yeah, I think like it sounds also like as if you need to know the periodization models as a way of having a guideline as well. So you just have like some kind of structure, which also brings me to the next question, because with periodization models, like you have the entire year planned out. For example, you know, like what certain competitions that are coming up. So you have like the entire year planned out. You know exactly what you're going to work on. Like, for example, now we're in May. So you would know what you would work on in October. That doesn't always sound realistic because there's many things that can come in way, and we never know, like we can't plan out unexpected things. But how do you plan out an entire year with emerging strategies? Because we have the tool that we can use, that we know our time to peak, so we can already plan out like how long the blocks would take, then also plan in certain pivot weeks. But how do you know what components you're going to work on during these blocks?
Sure. So, let's see, where do I want to start? There are a lot of, if you imagine like bottom up training and top down training as a spectrum, you're going to fall somewhere between the extremes. You kind of have to, nobody advocates like fully top down training. Like everyone would say, like, if you show up to the gym and you really feel like your hamstring's about to become injured, then you have to react to that emerging information, right? So that's a bottom up feedback loop that's built into those systems. So even the most top down systems aren't fully top down, right? And similarly, like we advocate for a more bottom up approach, but you can't be a fully bottom up approach because as an athlete, you've got to peak on a certain day, so there has to be some sort of imposition of a structure. Once you've established a time to peak and you kind of know the general training rhythm, then like that's the very minimum amount of top-down planning that you could do, I think, is to just kind of map out the development block structure. Then we typically go a step further than that. And, we say, imagine that you're in a scenario where you have decent information on the athlete. You've been working with them for a while. So you might know that, like, okay, this last block is going to be 5 weeks. And, we're going to do our tier 1 training interventions. So the things that have worked the best for this athlete in our data window, we're going to pull out all those most effective training interventions, and we use those during the last block. So the second to last block will want to be at least a few degrees different, but I wouldn't go so far as to plan them out in advance. There's some psychological baggage that comes along with that. You may think, I'll make adjustments as we get closer, or I'll rewrite the block, or I'll tweak the block as, new information comes available. It's never as effective to do it that way. And I think a lot of it has to do with psychology, the psychology of a coach. A coach is a person. And, we just kind of have a reluctance to redo that work, or you may make a decision and it's hard to recreate the thought process at some point in the future. The decisions that are made in real life are not always clear cut. They're often not clear cut. You're deciding between certain rep ranges or certain exercises when the information is fuzzy. It's not super clear. And you may say, well, if you've got 2 exercises, you're trying to decide between these 2 exercises and it's not clear cut that one is better than the other. Maybe it's a decision that doesn't matter so much. Well, maybe, but it could also be a very consequential decision and you just don't have good information on it. That's often the case as well. So I think you are best served by kind of stacking the psychological deck in your favor, write the training when it needs to be written, go through that thought process thoroughly once, so you don't have to recreate thought processes. You don't have to redo the work. You don't have to kind of fight against your own human nature. So that's kind of, I think that's kind of the minimum amount of top-down work that needs to be done. But more recently, I've started to think of training effects in 3 broad categories. And if we do that, that can help us do a little bit more top-down planning just to make sure that we're taking care to avoid overtaxing any one quality. Like this is, I think, what you were talking about a minute ago. So like the 3 broad categories would be the skill development, the structural adaptation, and the metabolic adaptation, like cellular energy. All training is going to have an effect on all 3 of those categories. It's either, an adaptation in the direction that you want, or I suppose it could be fairly neutral, or it's going to be an adaptation away from what you want. So maybe you would say that last block, you want the skill quality to be late rate of force development. Now, what does that mean exactly? Like what sorts of protocols is that going to lead to? Well, that depends. These are intended to be somewhat fuzzy concepts. You get to the specifics of it when it's time to write the block, but it's a category that means something to the coach and can help kind of guide those decision points. So maybe that last block is going to be, the skill component will be aimed at late rate of force development. The structural adaptation for powerlifting tends to be focused on muscular adaptations. I like to kind of use intensity as a guideline for that one. Probably higher intensities, and it's probably going to give you a training effect that's more focused on the contractile elements of the muscle fiber. So like what structures are going to be adapting as a result of this training. And then the energy system component for a powerlifter in the last block is probably going to be de-emphasized. So it's just not getting a whole lot of training in any direction, so, and then you can back that out. So you could build a plan that's even, several blocks long, provided that you're willing to, this is one that I'm a little more willing to make adjustments on it because it's fairly simple to do. It's not like having a pre-written block that redoing that would be a significant effort. This is like a sketch. So if the athlete gets injured or something happens, we miss one of the blocks, then redoing the plan like this is not particularly helpful. But you can pretty easily look at it and say, okay, we run 5-week blocks usually and 1-week pivots. So you structure it out and you could look at it and say, there's too many blocks here that focus on late rate of force development or that focus on like work capacity. We need to inject a bit of variety here so that we're not kind of hammering the same adaptations over and over and over again. So that's been very helpful in terms of getting enough change into the program and still preserving the bottom up nature of it.
But how does stress index come into play? Because in reactive training systems, we have the tool that we can use, and you also figure out what stress index works for a certain athlete. How do you play around with that in order to match those 3 main components? And also, how would you use it to your own benefit when you would plan out, for example, traditional linear competition prep?
So stress index is essentially a measure of training volume. It's technically kind of a unitless metric, but you could think of it like number of hard sets. It's fairly similar to a number of hard sets. So, a stress index of 5 would be a fairly challenging workout. They may say like 5 hard sets, that doesn't sound like much. Well, I bet your hard sets are not all that hard. the issue with counting strictly number of hard sets is that you have this trouble of like, where do you draw the line? Does a 7 RPE set count? Does an 8 RPE set count? Like what do you say counts as a hard set? And then once you cross that threshold, essentially hard sets count as 1 and not hard sets count as 0. And that's just a little bit too low resolution. Stress index attempts to be a bit more of a high resolution answer to that question. And it effectively helps you move past intensity when you're trying to measure training volume. Intensity is kind of a significant roadblock when it comes to things like tonnage or like relative volumes, things like that. Certain metrics they try to include intensity because we know that intensity matters. A set with lighter weight is different than a set with heavy weight. Like say you're going to do, 1 set of 10, with a light weight versus a set of 10 with an easy weight. You say which one is more taxing. I said that wrong. A set of 10 with a light weight versus a set of 10 with a heavy weight. Which one is more taxing? Well, obviously we know experientially the set of 10 with a heavy weight is more taxing. So how would you calculate that? Well, if you're just counting reps, they're the same. If you're just counting sets, then they're the same. So we just kind of have this sense that you have to factor in the load somehow. And that's true to an extent, but by factoring in intensity as either percent of 1RM or even in absolute terms, like the load on the bar, like you would use in a tonnage calculation, that it's almost like it overvalues the intensity component, or it skews it in some weird ways. And it makes, you still can't compare across intensity zones. So a difficult workout with low intensity versus a difficult workout with high intensity are just on different scales in terms of like the tonnage that's produced. And that's not particularly helpful from a coaching standpoint when, you need to plan out training. Something like stress index gets around most of that, all of it that I can see, so I know that if an athlete can recover and typically handles well, let's say a 12 stress a week for bench press, then 12 stress per week is good training load, whether we're talking about low intensities or high intensities, whether we're talking about easy sets or hard sets. It works regardless of exercise. It works regardless of things like rest interval, or, if you've got like really eccentrically biased training or anything like that, it tends to hold up well in a planning environment. So it helps me understand how difficult the training is going to be, kind of what the recovery demands of that training will be in terms of like, you'll be able to recover from this, or, you won't be able to recover from this. We're overreaching or something like that. It's a really useful tool.
Yeah, it is. That's really interesting, because how do you then differentiate between like central and peripheral stress? Because then you have the total stress and the athlete is able to recover from that. How do you differentiate the two?
Yeah. So a lot of the work on stress index, pardon me. I did some early development models for stress index. And then I had some communication with Robert Frederick, who had kind of noticed the same problem and had worked on it independently. And we had like completely different methods for getting at that number. But like if you would plot the curves, they generated like the same shape of curve, so like we're seeing the same relationship, but just kind of, completely independently came up with a similar solution, which I always think is pretty cool. And then after that, like through communication, I really liked Robert's method. And so I have implemented a lot of like the mathematical concepts and stuff like that that underpin it. And one of those is just as by way of calculating it, one thing that he did was instead of like looking at a set as an entire thing, he looked at each repetition, and tried to calculate the stress of each repetition independently and then add them together. So that would produce the sum total of stress for a set is like the stress of all the individual repetitions, right? And it's not a linear relationship, right? So if you imagine you've got a 10 RM on the bar, let's think a 10 RM squat, and you do that 10 RM. The first rep is relatively easy. The second rep is a bit harder, and the third rep is a bit harder. And then obviously the last rep is extremely hard, so it kind of goes from easy to hard, but how does it go from easy to hard? Like, what's the relationship there? And he's written quite a bit about that relationship, and I think it's a really, really smart observation. It's not a linear relationship is the other piece of this as well. But I guess what I want to get at is that the mathematical approach of adding together individual rep stresses versus trying to just aggregate it all into a set lets you do some rather neat stuff. It sounds like it would be more error prone, but I don't think it is. I think it all kind of comes out in the wash. But by calculating them out rep by rep, you can add them together, and that gives you like the total stress. And that's mostly what we look at when we're talking about stress index. Or you could average them together. You could say like, what's the average stress per rep, and that tends to map a lot closer to intensity. I mean, it seems obvious if you think about it that way, like heavier weights produce more stress per rep than lighter weights. But when you calculate it out that way, they start to take on a bit of a different character. They haven't been anchored, to my knowledge, they haven't been anchored to specific physiological phenomenon. I mean, we suspect, and Robert's done a lot of work like making correlations that he's come across in research, but I don't think it's been directly investigated yet. But a lot of what I've done with it is more observational. So I might say, like if you average the stress per rep, I call that central stress, and we can put the name aside in a second, come back to it if you like, but I call it central stress, and it maps quite well to intensity. It also turns out that using a stress index metric, even to track intensity, gets you around some issues that you would run into by trying to calculate an average intensity and use that in a planning process as well. So I think there's strengths to using the central stress metric for an intensity planning standpoint as well. But I would I'm looking at this metric and saying, what do I notice about training programs that have a lot of central stress or that don't have very much central stress? And you start to notice some generalized effects on athletes, that when you train them with a whole lot of heavy weights, they tend to experience fatigue in a certain way. And that's a lot of what I ended up calling it central stress. I think Robert came up with some different naming conventions that he uses. And I'm not suggesting that it's like physiological central nervous system fatigue that you would experience. It's more like a centralization of the fatigue symptoms. So most people feel generally run down, generally like brain fog, tired type of feelings. Whereas the other metric, which we call peripheral stress, tends to produce like more localized effects, like muscle soreness and possibly joint stiffness and things like that. So
yeah,
you end up with these two metrics, central stress and peripheral stress, and that hopefully helps you to understand the training effects a bit more.
Yeah. But when you plan out and you block and you keep the same total stress, do you also consider psychological factors when like playing around with the central and peripheral stress?
Can you give me an example of what you mean?
For example, we know that central stress, it's like more based on higher intensities. And like it brings, like what comes with that is also higher fatigue, generally speaking. So that can also psychologically fatigue you. Do you also consider that when you plan out a block, that okay, for example, this athlete is really prone to fatiguing mentally really quickly. So let's say I put a higher peripheral stress then. Okay. It's really interesting that you can play around with that kind of stuff when you want to plan out a block. Yeah.
Yeah. John especially has noticed certain athletes being sensitive to central stress, or certain athletes being sensitive to peripheral stress and things like that. But I mean, it's an observable quality. And I think even outside of the stress index paradigm, we observe that high intensities affect some people more than others. Some people, if there are heavy singles in a program, they react negatively to that. Sometimes it's physiological. Lots of times it's psychological. And there's, even with that, like there's not a super clear distinction between those things. They react badly, and the cause of that bad reaction is not always clear, right? But you can boil that down to, this person reacts well or reacts poorly to central stress or peripheral stress, or like at the point where you have the information systems in place, you can point them at kind of whatever you want, like whatever variables you want.
But let's bring in a case study at this point, because you have an example of Brett Gibbs, who didn't reply very well to higher intensities. And the interesting story behind that, you can also explain it yourself, is that like during the Worlds prep, you actually came up with a complete different strategy. So the complete reverse of linear competition prep. So basically you did a reverse linear approach.
Yeah.
How did you came up with that, and how was that?
Yeah. So Brett did not respond to like high intensities if it was the average intensity of the program. He was able to handle instances of higher intensity. So he may be able to handle a single or something like that. But the bulk of the work, if the bulk of the work started to increase in intensity, his response was not good. And as we're getting ready for the Worlds, I'm looking at his training blocks, and I notice kind of this pattern that anytime the intensity goes up, our results go down. And if the intensity stays low, the results are tremendous, So we started with that in mind, as we're kind of laying out the block structure. I knew that I wanted that last block prior to competition to be low intensities. And in his case, his greatest response was, if I remember correctly, like we're talking specifically about Brett's deadlift. And if I remember correctly, his best response was around 70% of 1RM. So we would train, there would be a single because he could handle that. I've had some athletes that can't, but Brett could. There would be a single at 8 RPE or something like that. But the bulk of his work would be in the 70% range. And then, backwards from that, we said, okay, well, if that's his best response, that'll be the last block. What do we do in the second to last block? Right. So it was a bit higher intensity was his second best training response. I forget exactly what the number was. It was 75 or 80%. And then the third to last block kind of formed an extension of that pattern, And the accessory movements, the supplemental movements were rotated in those programs as well, but follow a similar-ish structure of intensity. So it did kind of make this descending intensity program where as the competition approached, the intensity went down, but the athlete response to those intensities went up as expected. And he came into that competition, deadlifted extremely well. At the time, he was the heaviest 10 times body weight total, won the world championship that year. And it was a really, really great performance from him. But like that was specifically his deadlift, and you could, tweak the approach for the bench and tweak the approach for the squat so that each individual lift is kind of structured in a way that's ideal for that lift.
Yeah, I really like that you just mentioned that like you can have different approaches within a block for different lifts. You don't have to go with one specific approach for each lift because every lift can react in a different way. But what can also change is athlete response over time. So I'm really curious to hear if Brett Gibbs, like his athlete response stayed over time or if that changed afterwards.
It more or less stayed. In Brett's case, we worked together for a while after that. I'm not sure how long, another year or so, but Brett had some injuries that were continuing to not play very nicely. And then COVID was particularly disruptive, and Brett's kind of taken a step back from competing at this point. So we didn't get to see too much about Brett's specific response, like over the long term with that. I can say like from other cases that the response does seem to be fairly stable. I mean, you expect people to change, right? Like the whole point of training is to create change and adaptation, so we do need to revisit these greatest hits and kind of reevaluate them from time to time. The time scale for that's not super clear. Like what's the shelf life on this data that we gather? My operating consideration has been like 2 years. If we're pulling block reviews that are more than 2 years old, maybe that's not the best, maybe that's not the most reliable anymore, but there's no reason it has to be 2 years. It could be less than that. And I would assume that if you've got a younger athlete who's adapting more rapidly, that shelf life is going to be shorter. And then if you've got an athlete that is in a more stable situation and it's just, more of a long-term type of environment, that shelf life is going to be on the longer end.
But like specifically now for younger athletes or newer athletes in general. So we know that their response can change very quickly, and what has worked for them in the beginning might not work for them after a few months. What indicators are you looking for in order to determine, okay, the athlete's response has changed? Or is it mainly related due to the fact that the athlete might be desensitized to the training stimulus and needs like a different kind of stimulus for a while and come back to it later?
That at this point is still kind of an intuitive decision, I suppose. The coach kind of has to, at some point, the coach has to make a judgment, and that is one point where we see that currently. What's the shelf life for the data? Why did we not get the response that we were hoping for this time? Everyone knows as well that there are external life event factors that come into it as well. So just because the block didn't go well this time doesn't necessarily mean that, they won't respond to it in the future. It doesn't necessarily mean that, it's just not going to work anymore. It could be a sensitivity issue, like you mentioned. It could be, they had a particularly stressful few months at home or something like that. So it's important to communicate with the athlete. And I think that athletes, especially at the point where you're engaged with the training process and maybe you've been doing this for a little while, a couple years, few years, there will be kind of a perceptual events that happen for the athlete. And if we can get at a good communication rhythm, then sometimes the athlete can tell me what they're feeling, and that can be helpful as well. I find that lots of powerlifters will get like suddenly bored at the end of a training block, or people experience it different ways. I know, like for me, I experience it as like a feeling of boredom. Some people, it's a feeling of fatigue or lethargy. And it doesn't do to just describe it that way. Like there's a certain quality to it. And once you feel it a few times, you can start to be able to identify that. Like, oh, I'm not just fatigued because I'm training hard, or I'm not just fatigued because I'm not sleeping well. This kind of feeling is associated with the end of a block, or this kind of, I feel like this just isn't producing the same effect that it did last time. So maybe we need to resensitize to it. So it still relies very heavily on athlete communication, athlete feedback into the system, both from like a nuts and bolts data, like how many sets and reps did you do? What's the RPE? But also in a qualitative way, like what's your subjective experience like right now?
Another question that I would have is for emerging strategies specifically, are there any limitations to it? Because we know the limitations of the top-down approach. Now we have the bottom-up approach. How would you say, like, where are the limitations for coaching?
It relies very heavily on the coach and really coach-athlete engagement. So there's always the communication issues that I discussed a minute ago. That's one limitation. Earlier we were talking about kind of the stability of the system, and a top-down system gives you structure and takes some pressure off of the coach to be creative or to create that structure on their own as they go. A top-down approach gives that to you. A bottom-up approach does not. So it's up to the coach to decide, what is the structure that we want to implement? How do we want to implement it? How long should the blocks be? None of that stuff can be taken for granted if you've got a bottom-up approach. So there's a communication piece that's an important one. There's the stability, structure, paradigm piece. That's also an important one. It relies on coaching engagement as well. Like the coach has to be attentive to the process. You can't coach on autopilot is what I'm getting at. Like I've seen in my lesser moments earlier in my career have been a coach who would, well, that went okay. Let's just move on to the next block. And that's not the best that you can do, like you can do better than that if you apply the effort, if you kind of push yourself in the direction of like, really, is that the best we can do? What if we go a bit deeper on the data? Can we see any trends? Can we see any useful tweaks that we might make? And it's really important for a coach to give that kind of input it's really important for a coach to give that kind of input in a bottom-up system. If there's a top-down system, you can take some of that for granted, which, it could be good or bad. It's like the potential upside from encouraging that type of analysis is really good. But if you don't do it, then the top-down structure kind of saves you a bit, whereas the bottom-up structure will not. The Smith machine squats, kind of that analogy kind of comes back in a bit, where you can't doing a Smith machine squat with a lot of weight is not as impressive. There's just not as much going on. It constrains the expression in a lot of ways, but it also means that the amount of deviation from the ideal is a lot less as well. Whereas like a free weight squat, yeah, it can be way better, but it could also be quite a bit worse. So the range is bigger. So I think a lot of it comes back to that. So depending on a lot on athlete communication, depending on the buy-in to the process, it relies on kind of the coach's attention, like to be really attentive and engaged with the process. There's bigger penalties for trying to coach on autopilot. So those are some of the limitations as I see them. And then like I suppose the last one I should mention is variability. Some people have really variable lives, lives with ups and downs and schedule. Like it doesn't have to be like emotional ups and downs, but just like big schedule changes and things like that can provide some difficulty in a bottom-up approach like emerging strategies where you're really trying to analyze athlete response. That type of variability can muddy the data a bit, which makes it a bit harder. A top-down approach gets around a lot of that by imposing a structure that you're not going to change anyway. A bottom-up approach with its additional degrees of freedom, that type of variability can make it can be more difficult to see the patterns. But it's also worth pointing out that all of these limitations pretty much are still limitations with a top-down system. They're not ever good. It's not ever ideal to have a lot of variability for an athlete. It's not ever ideal to have poor coach-athlete communication. It's not ideal to coach on autopilot. It's just that the penalties for doing it are different in different systems.
Yeah, but I see it also as an advantage because we know like if there's too much noise in the communication, it can like reduce the quality of our coaching and also ultimately the coaching experience of the athlete. But like the noise that we have, like the internal and external stressors that we can't always influence, I'd say they are present whether we use a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach. So we can use that to our advantage and try to like also educate the athletes to like how we want to communicate with them. So
yeah,
I think every model has limitations, but we can definitely also use them to our advantage for sure. But that also brings me to the last question. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But that also brings me to the last question now, because like we know that a lot of factors can influence the success of a block. We can't always control all of these factors, but I know that you're always trying to like find the key of the magic program, and a lot of coaches try to do that as well. How can we even determine whether the program itself was the main like success factor? Or also like I want to bring in your new idea of the track hour system, because you're trying to plan out every little detail of a training. So how do you see that?
I suppose the truth of it is we don't know. You don't know for sure that it's the training that's making the difference. But over time, if the athlete is training and you change their training in systematic ways, right? Like there are blocks and each block is different and you start to see these patterns emerge. Every time we do pause squats, your squat gets better. Can we be sure that it's the pause squats that's doing it? Could it be something else? This is a correlation causation problem. And it's important to note that, yeah, it's just a correlation. We can't be sure. We can't determine causality here. But we can't ever determine causality in this type of information environment. you've got one individual who responds in a at least somewhat unique way, and you're trying to optimize this output, which is squat strength in this example. But not only is it one individual, but the individual is always adapting and changing so that the individual that you're dealing with today is different from the individual you were dealing with, 6 months ago or a year ago. The injury history is different. The years of experience are different, right? And hopefully they've made structural adaptations and skill adaptations and all that stuff along the way. So you could never even run the experiments to determine causality if you wanted to. So correlation's all we have, But at some point we have to say, this seems like you have to do something. We can't just throw our hands up and say, well, we can't know for sure, so I quit sports. We're going to do something. And so if correlation's the best that we have, then we have to go with that. So I think it's a reasonable correlation too. It's not like classically I see when people are teaching about like correlation causation data, there's one example I see people bring up that's like, correlating Nicolas Cage movies to the number of swimming pool, like accidents in swimming pools that result in death or something like that. Like two things that are obviously wildly unrelated, yet they correlate. So it's like a great example of like this correlation causation problem. And I suppose it could be that, right? Like, are the pause squats really driving your squat progress, or could it be, merely this spurious correlation? I mean, I suppose it could be a Nicolas Cage movie example, but that seems fairly unlikely. And the more times that we can repeat that, the more unlikely it's going to seem. And you've got to train your squat some way. It seems to make sense from a rationale standpoint as well. So, you can, I think that's as confident as we can ever be in prescribing an intervention. I think any more confidence than that is, not deserved.
Yeah. I mean, we have to justify our decisions. And also, I really like the fact that you brought up that if we repeat something, then we will more likely know if it's working or not, or if it was really like that was causing it. Because one thing that also got stuck in my head from the last podcast about the periodization, when you talked about the complete opposite approach that you did with Brett Gibbs, the uncommon approach, I think it was John Cuddy who said that, if it wouldn't have worked, then you would have blamed it on the program. But now if it worked, you don't really know if it was really the program. The only way that shows you that it could have been the program was the prior experience, and also repeating that type of approach. But then you never know for sure. So that's really interesting.
That's true.
Yeah.
I think I missed the part of the question you were asking about the track R stuff.
If you want to talk about that, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah, that's fine. Can you frame that again for me?
So basically you're trying
what the question was.
Yeah, you're always someone who tries to analyze every little detail of a training, like how do you use track R to your advantage?
So a way to think of it for anyone who doesn't already know what it is, I call it a dynamic load management system. So it's prescribing training loads, and it's trying to be responsive to the athlete's fatigue state. But really, even more than that, it's trying to be responsive to what they've actually done recently, So as the athlete makes changes to the training program, which is inevitable, they're going to be, some sets are going to be harder than expected. Some sets might be easier than expected. Maybe they have to they're short on time, so they have to superset some exercises, or they have to cut a session short or move some sessions throughout the week or anything like that. Training's a bit heavier than was originally planned, or all these adjustments that get made on the fly. My original thought was like, if I was coaching one athlete and that's all I had to worry about was this one athlete, what would I tell them to do? I think the exact scenario was I had an athlete who missed a session. I think it was due to being sick. Could have been a schedule issue, but they missed a session, And the stock standard advice was just to, well, let that one go and get back on the program and follow it from here. And I think that's a not bad solution. But the thought is, like, if I had only one athlete and as much time as I wanted to spend on that one athlete, is that the very best that I could do? And the answer, I think, is no, that there will be some sort of adjustment that needs to be made or something like that. And you see adjustments that get made in a more heavy-handed kind of way sometimes, like, hey, coach, I've got to change my schedule up and I'm going to be training like the last 3 days of my program. It'll be 3 days in a row, which is not typical, And you may look at it and say, okay, try to get it all in. It's going to be hard, but try to do it anyway. Or you may say, that's going to be too much, so we're going to cut out some of the accessory work or something like that. Those are all very broad changes. They're imprecise changes, and they're changes that will affect the character of the training program as well. Now you just have less accessory work that week, or the quality of work is different, or you've suddenly accumulated a tremendous amount of training volume in a really short amount of time, which is not always the safest decision. So I thought, again, it goes back to, like, if I had one athlete and I could spend as much time as I wanted, could I do a better job than this? And I think the answer is yes. And TrackR is an attempt to systematize that process and make it so that, I'm not trying to make those decisions by hand, or I'm not trying to, rely on my own intuitions too much and things of that nature. So I can kind of make those decisions in a more repeatable way. So if I have a schedule change, or I overshoot my RPEs, or I misread what was on the program, like any number of things, those things get taken into account and fed back into the system so that there are downstream changes to the training program. Just to give an example, let's say that I had a training program where I really overshot my RPEs. So the training is now heavier than is originally intended, So should some aspect of the training program be lighter in order to compensate for that? Well, I mean, in the TrackR system, it depends on how you set it up, but that's an option for the coach then at that point to set up these types of scenarios that will adjust to the actual input of the athlete. And you see other things too, like, recovery is a bit variable. Maybe the athlete can typically handle 15 stress on bench, in most blocks, but for whatever reason in this block, they're accumulating fatigue too rapidly. Well, that should get fed back into the system, and the system should adjust by reducing the total stress of the work, but not too much. So it's a process of trying to externalize a lot of that. And I've really come into contact with just how many decisions there are to be made in terms of, like, what threshold do you start making these adjustments, and then how much of an adjustment do you make? And it seems like that rabbit hole never ends almost, but I don't want to go back to the other way of thinking about training though.
But the first time when I saw the sheet of the track, or like I felt like as a coach being on a playground, because like you have all of
Yeah.
these different stressors for like this. You have in reactive training systems, you have like the 3 stress indexes, like total stress, central stress, and peripheral stress. And then in the track, you have stresses for the triceps, for the biceps, like for each different
Yeah.
muscle. It's totally
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah. You can break it down like lots and lots of different ways. And once you have these tools, then it gives you different ways of understanding the training that's being, like the stress that's being imparted on the athlete. Like I can say for myself, I've noticed over the years that like I have prior back injury and it seems to be sensitive to shearing loads. So things like squats and deadlifts are like I can handle some of it, but not, there is a limit, And however, you could give me something like a front squat that doesn't have as much shearing stress. It's more like vertically compressive. And I can handle as much of that as I like. And then there are other things that, still train the legs, but don't really tax the spine the same way. So trying to model that stuff out and account for it has been really helpful from a load management standpoint. Like I know that like in a gradual exposure therapy type of scenario, you want to like take my back, for example. I want to give my back enough stress so that it gradually adapts and responds, but not so much that it becomes an injury. So this allows me to track those things independently of each other. So I can say, in the last block I could say, in today's session, I can handle 2 sets of squats, and that will be kind of the limit of the stress I want to put on my back. And then from there, I still need to do some training for my quads or my whatever. So I'm going to shift over to leg press, or I'm going to shift to front squats or something else that won't kind of provide that same type of stress. And I can track it in a more systematic way. I can just be more deliberate about it, and it's not static either. So I know that, if let's say that I can handle, I think currently it's around a 3 stress per week in terms of like the spinal shearing stress that I can handle. So if I'm handling that and it's going well, it's going fine, then I could push it a bit. I could increase from that 3 baseline, But how rapidly do you do that? Well, that can all be built into the system so that it increases at a reasonable pace that I've decided on. And it's not, the eyeball it, that looks about right type of methods, And conversely, if I have a pivot, let's say, and I've constructed this pivot so that there's just not a lot of shearing stress, maybe the baseline goes down below 3, and I shouldn't just automatically jump in to what I had been doing prior to this. Maybe there needs to be a ramping up period. And then how does all that interact with training for other muscle groups or other muscle or movement patterns and things like that? That can all be handled deliberately. And so far, the results have been much better. I've had fewer back issues in this period of my training than I have really since my back injury started.
I think that's great. That's really impressive. But at the same time, like I really like that you're trying to be as precise as possible with the program, because that can facilitate decision making. At the same time, it's also really complex, But it seems like
Yeah.
you have like the spectrum. On one hand, you have like the top down approach of periodization models. Then you have, on the other hand, the track R, which is also completely planned out. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. But do you plan on incorporating?
That's a really good point. Like,
do you plan
sorry, go
on
ahead.
incorporating this into the training book in the future?
I would love to. As you, I think, have seen, it's not very user-friendly at the moment. We've had to do a lot. I haven't done as good a job as I probably should have in even just instructing our staff on that. That's something that I'll be trying to remedy. But I think in general, the system needs to be made more simple. And if we can do that, then I would love to incorporate that into our info systems. So far, all the changes have been in the direction of making training more complex. So I'll have to move away from that at some point and start making things more simple. But I would
But I guess
love
in the
to
beginning,
start, even just like start making smaller, like porting over certain ideas from the track R
Mhm.
system, and I think hopefully eventually we'll get there.
Yeah. But in the beginning, you always have to analyze the complexity of every component in a way that you can
Yeah.
afterwards simplify it. That's just what it is.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. The way of things.
that's
Yeah.
really interesting. Yeah. Anyways,
Sure.
thank you for your time. I really appreciate that you, as I already said, sacrificed your sleep to do the interview.
Oh,
Thanks a lot.
I'm happy to do it. Happy to do it. Thank you. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
the thoughtful questions. And it's always enjoyable to kind of explore these ideas. You have clearly put a lot of thought into it and have I would like to hear your insights on a lot of this stuff as well, because I think you've got really great perspective on it.